I'm Bob, and this here is my place.
You're going to get some opinions.
I'm Bob. Would you knock me out, please?
Mixed in with a little news, the latest weather, some sports, and maybe even a little reminiscing.
Started humming a song from 1962.
And you're almost guaranteed to hear something that's going to make you smile.
Bob, we love playing here tonight.
But if you're not careful, you might even learn a thing or two.
Very interesting.
Live from the studios of Longport Media, it's time for Bob Burns in your afternoon.
We'll talk to Bob.
And now, here's Bob.
We're back. All right, we have our guest on the line. We have Rich Harwood on the line. Rich, how are you today?
Bob, it's good to be with you.
Yeah, glad you came on the line. That's I've been telling people that it is. Let me find my sheet here. It is the Harwood Institute for Public Innovation.
Right.
I have to tell you something. I was looking on your website here, and let me see. It says you say someplace on here, "Be true to yourself." Is that what you say?
Stay true to yourself.
Stay true to yourself. One of my favorite. My only favorite Shakespeare play is Macbeth, and he says, "To thine own self be true."
Right.
And, I understand exactly what that means. You can fool everybody, but you can't fool yourself.
That's right.
And I've been signing off my show. I've been doing a show here on this radio station for over 16 years, and when I sign off my show, I like the Beach Boys. The Beach Boys say it better. They say, "Be true to your school."
with a better tune, right?
Yeah, much better tune than Macbeth. Yeah, but it's the same thing. To thine own self be true to your school, or be true to yourself, and that's exactly that's a great premise to start with. So tell us a little bit about Rich Harwood and all your great ideas.
Well, I started the Institute a number of years ago, about 25 years ago, when I was 27, and the basic mission of the Institute is that we teach and coach individuals and organizations across the country how to solve problems in their communities, and importantly, how they can change the way communities work together, so that we can not only solve the particular challenge that we're working on at the moment, but that we can actually have a chance to solve other challenges as we move forward together.
It's it's all kind of interesting to me that Well, tell me how you decided that you wanted to create this. How did you decide 25 years ago this is what you'd want to do for the rest of your life?
Well, I think it was a combination of factors, some of which led from me being a really sick kid who spent a lot of time in hospital beds with doctors and nurses and specialists all surrounding me, all talking to one another about me, but seldom ever talking with me. And you learn at a pretty young age what it feels like to be invisible and to not feel as though you're seen and heard, and to lose hope, frankly. And so I think that was part of it. Another part of it was there were any number of people growing up who rallied around me and who really demonstrated to me the power of community, of people coming together and working together for something larger than themselves. I worked on, by the time I was 23, 20 political campaigns. The last one, I was a young aide on a U.S. presidential race, and I learned there that while the people who were really running for office, the candidates, typically were good and decent people, these campaigns were really about dividing people, about winning, and frankly, they had lost sight of the ability to see and hear all people and to give people a genuine sense of hope. And so, when I was 27, against the advice of all the people that were around me, I decided to break out and see if I could make this work.
It had to be a tough road at the beginning, huh?
Yeah, it was very tough. This was in the mid '80s, so the types of things we're doing now weren't done nearly as much as they are being done, and there wasn't, in a sense, a market for this work, and the work that we're doing now, Bob, is all stuff that myself and my team over these last 25 years have really created and innovated to figure out how things can work better in communities. What does it mean to authentically engage people? What does it mean to bring people together around their shared aspirations as opposed to our complaints and claims on limited public resources? What does it mean to develop organizations that are turned outward toward their communities as opposed to only being concerned about raising money for their own survival? It was a tough go, but I think where we are now is that, our work has spread to thousands of communities across the U.S. and has found its way to 40 other countries. And I think what it represents more than anything is a hunger, particularly in the U.S., for a different way of doing business in our communities.
What was the first project that you worked on?
Oh gosh, the first project I worked on was about how elected leaders, government leaders, elected leaders, whether or not they really wanted to engage with the public and their communities in a real way, whether or not they were really interested in understanding what people were concerned about, their aspirations, or were they mostly concerned with managing the public almost at an arm's distance so that they could go up and do their work but not be bothered by people in their communities. That was the first, actually I had the cover of the, it was 25 or more years ago. I had the cover of the report as you asked me. That sort of flashed back into my mind. It was a yellow cover. We called it the Yellow Report because we didn't have a better name at the time. And that was the first one we did.
I was an elected official. I was mayor of the town that I live in.
The town of?
Egg Harbor Township, New Jersey.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you described two different politicians there.
And which one were you?
I was the guy. I was in the middle of it all.
Right.
I liked sparring with not sparring. I liked talking with the people and getting their opinions and telling them that, I didn't try to be the smartest guy on the planet because I'm not. I'm just a simple country boy who drives a pickup. And, I needed some direction. I need people to tell me what they wanted to have done. I mean, it's fairly simple as far as I can see it.
Yeah, we've it's an interesting response. I think we've made things much more complicated than they need to be. There's the old saying, too cute by half. And, I think a lot of our elected officials and their consultants and their pollsters and all the other, their direct mail gurus, we've turned it into an industry to win votes and to win money and so forth, when in fact it's really supposed to be about people.
Yeah, it is. It's supposed to be about people and what they do. All right, let's talk about Newtown a little bit. That's certainly an accomplishment on your part, and it had to be. Just talk about how you. First of all, how did you get contacted? How did you end up in the midst of that? Yeah,
I know it's a crazy thing, isn't it? I mean, the massacre in Newtown happened December 14th. I think maybe around February 14th or thereabouts. I got a phone call from a woman named Pat Lodra, who is what's called the first selectman, but essentially the chief executive officer, the mayor of Newtown. And they had, they had done a national. Sandy Hook Elementary School had been closed after the massacre. They were trying to figure out what to do with the school. They came to the conclusion, Pat really in her leadership came to the conclusion that they needed someone from the outside to guide them through this process, whatever the process would be. And they needed someone who had experience with working in public, because all these meetings were going to be in public, working with elected officials, working with communities, and working on highly charged emotional issues. And I'd been recommended by a couple of people, and they called me and asked me if I'd be interested in doing it. And honestly, at first, I was kind of floored, and I was like, let me think about it. I'm not sure. And then, I realized I had as much a responsibility as anything to say yes. And ultimately, I ended up going up there in early March and leading them through the process, which ended in May.
How did that go? What was that like?
Well, as you can imagine, it's gut-wrenching. It's on the surface, I think for people, I can imagine on the outside looking into Newtown, what it appeared to be was a decision about what do you do with an empty building where a massacre occurred, which is, hard enough, but really what was much harder and more difficult and more real was that this was really a decision about whether or not a community that had gone through trauma and despair was ready, willing, and able to pivot to healing and hope. That's really what this became about. It was really about whether or not the community was ready to take a step forward. And ultimately, they chose to take that step forward. It was a process that went over a couple months. Each session, as I mentioned, was in public. It was, Pat Lodra, what she decided to do was pull together 28 elected officials from 4 different governing boards who had never worked together before and certainly had never worked together around something like this. She pulled them together into an ad hoc group to make a decision about what to do moving forward with the school. And as you can know from your days now on the radio and your days as an elected official, it really was a recipe for potential grandstanding, political posturing, people pushing their own point of view on what to do. It could have easily broken down. And in fact, there was a huge debate in the community about whether or not the community was even ready to tackle something like this at this point so soon after the massacre. And ultimately, unfortunately, it ended up working out.
I guess it would have to happen rather rapidly, because if you didn't take some sort of action, it would be easy just to delay it and delay it and delay it.
Well, that was the dilemma. Really, it was a dilemma they were in. There were lots of people, and including experts, who said, look, you ought to wait a year, or at least 6 months. Let's wait till June of 2013, or let's wait till now, of 2013, December 2013, going into 2014. Let's let things settle down. Let's let the families of victims, the families whose first graders were shot dead, the families of survivors, those first families of first graders who survived the massacre. Let's let the teachers, who many of whom really were deeply traumatized by this event. They saw kids shot, they saw their colleagues shot, they hid kids in storerooms and in restrooms. They ran with their kids to the firehouse to safety. Let's let the teachers decompress and find some time. There were all the first responders who, in a town like Newtown of 28,000, they're all volunteers, where most of them are volunteers. So you had all these first responders going and seeing horrific scenes. Let's give them some time and space to work through all this. And in a small town, as you know, and as your listeners in South Jersey know, everyone ultimately becomes touched by this because the town's so small.
Yeah.
I mean, either you're touched directly, or someone who's touched, or you're on a little league or a soccer team with, where their kid may have been shot or threatened. So the idea was let's let things decompress. And I think Pat Lodra, in her wisdom, said, well, we could do that, or we could try to move forward and see if we can make some decisions. And ultimately, that's what they did. One last thing on this. Politically speaking, there was pressure because the governor of Connecticut had promised financial support to rebuild the school, and they would need between $40 and $60 million to do that. The President of the United States had made some promises, and everyone was really afraid that if they let the legislative season in Hartford or in D.C. end, those promises would evaporate.
Yeah.
And there's good reason to feel that way.
Absolutely, there is. Absolutely, yeah. They get dense after the legislation adjourns for the Christmas break or whatever break it is. Yeah,
exactly.
Sure.
It's in the heat of the moment, and in the emotion of the moment is probably a better way to put it. We all make all sorts of promises and pledges, and then as time passes and politics takes over and parochialism takes over because people outside the community want the money for other things,
sure, yeah.
It becomes much harder to keep those promises.
All right. Well, Rich, let me tell you, I'm going to put you on hold for a minute. We're going to take a break. When we come back, I'd like you to think about one of the other projects you worked on that was your favorite, and I really want you to talk about this turning outward and all the different aspects of that and what difference that can make in people's lives, all right?
Sounds good.
All right, Rich, we're talking to Rich Harwood, and we'll be back in just a couple minutes.
News Talk 1400 WOND. WOND. Radio.com.
Now, back to Bob Burns in your afternoon on News Talk 1400 WOND.
All right, we're talking with Rich Harwood. He is from the Harwood Institute for Public Innovation. How's it going out there, Rich?
Doing well. Good to be
right.
with you.
Tell me about one of your favorite projects that you worked on.
Well, I think, I can take one that we're doing now in Battle Creek, Michigan, something that I think a lot of people can identify with. We started working with a group up there of people from six different organizations. When they started working with us, they were convinced they were going to start a new nonprofit organization, start yet another program, go out and get more money, the typical path that gets followed. And as they went out and started to engage the community and listen to people, what they heard from folks is, we want a more caring, connected community that demonstrates it can actually solve a problem, and please don't start another program. We've got enough of them here, and we don't see anything getting solved. And as they talked more and more to people, what they found out was that there was a new community, the Burmese community was growing, but was invisible to the rest of the community. And the Burmese community was basically saying what the rest of the community said, which is we want to be part of a larger community, and we want to solve something here. And they found out that they had all sorts of health care issues that weren't being addressed. Moms, particularly with giving childbirth, they were going to hospitals and no one spoke Burmese, and they were on the phone with translators 1,000 miles away, and there were no neonatal care and other things after children were born. And so this group decided that instead of starting a new program, they would take the knowledge that they were gaining from the community and start to convene different groups around the town to talk about not pointing fingers about why were these problems existing, but how do we solve this, and what do you make of what we're learning? And lo and behold, Bob, out of all this, different healthcare groups started to step forward and say, well, actually, we can fix that problem. Or Kellogg Community College said, well, we have a healthcare program here and we have a translation program here, but we've never done a translation program around healthcare and the Burmese population, so they created a new effort around that. As they began to solve some of these issues with the Burmese community, the city manager started to knock on the door, and the Community Foundation and the United Way and other groups, and said, school superintendent, we like how you're solving problems in this community. It's a different way to do it. We're not arguing all the time. We're actually trying to figure out how we can move forward. Why don't we work together on some larger issues? And so all of these different groups have adopted this, what we call turning outward approach. And now they've come together to work on the transition point for middle school kids to high school, because that's where we lose a lot of children, at least in Battle Creek and a lot of other towns. And so to me, this is sort of a quick story. It's much more complicated and involved, but a quick story about, it's possible to change the way we do things in communities. It's possible to solve problems, and it's possible to spread a new approach that actually gets people working in different ways together.
It's tough to do,
it's
though.
Not a miracle.
Yeah, it's tough to do. You get people pulling on the same end of the rope, especially when they want to create something. So you're turning outward, and you have different impacts that are enumerated here on the website. Mm-hmm. You want to go over a couple of those?
Sure. Which one do you want to pick up?
Well, let's just start with engagement.
Well, I think when groups, leaders, like we were talking about elected leaders before, nonprofits, school districts, other groups, neighborhood associations, we've all been to meetings where essentially one of two things happens. Either someone either the conversations devolve into shouting matches and people pointing fingers and placing blame at each other for why, for instance, our public schools aren't working in our town. Or someone comes out and says, let's get together and have a conversation, but there's some person in front of the room, the expert, the public official, who basically just talks the whole time and never asks a question. And what we found in our work is if we can turn outward toward our communities and actually get people together to talk about what are our aspirations, our shared aspirations for moving forward, what it does is it unlocks these nasty, acrimonious, and divisive discussions and gets us focusing on something we can achieve, gets us realizing that while we don't share everything in common, there's more than enough to start to work on together that we do share. And that there's actually something that we can say that we're for as opposed to simply always arguing about what we're against. And again, it's not rocket science. It's not some miracle. It's, in a lot of ways, it's common sense. But the problem is that our organizations, our leaders, our neighborhood groups, we've all adopted approaches that keep getting us into these fixes and into these problems, and we need to find a different path out. And so on the engagement piece that you mentioned, we found some alternative ways, some better paths for communities to take that are practical and real and effective that make a difference.
I think all 6 of these pieces that are up here are all as important as each other. But I think strategies is probably, that's the difficult one. You watch these people in Congress, I mean, they're trying to do stuff, but they have no strategy.
They have no strategy, and, again, if you relate it to a community, which your listeners may want, is, we decide that we want to fix something in a community, and what we end up doing is adopting. I was in Hartford, Connecticut recently, where we're doing work in a neighborhood that's had some problems, and all these experts and organizations are up there working, and they've all adopted their own favorite program or strategy for quote unquote fixing this community. And we went up there and we engaged the community and listened to people's aspirations, and here's what we found. People wanted a safer, more connected community. They wanted, everyone in the community said they had been pushed indoors because of the threat of crime on the streets, drug dealers and prostitutes and others, and that every time 2 or more people congregated on the street, the police dispersed them because they thought they were loiterers, and then they were up to no good.
Yeah.
And what people in that community, this is a neighborhood called Asylum Hill, what people in that community told us was, we need to clean up some of this crime because we want to come out onto our streets and reclaim our streets, get to know one another, and find ways that we can actually work together to improve our community. That's the first step we need to take. And so, this whole point about strategies or strategies that fit a local context, before we rush off and sort of assume we know what the problem is and try to impose solutions on a community, like in Hartford, we ought to take some time to listen to what people are really wrestling with, figure out what strategies are really needed, then look at what strategies have worked maybe in other communities that might work in this community, what things we need to grow ourselves in our own community, and how it is that we can actually take action that addresses people's concerns and gets some progress.
The big news today is Detroit, they filed bankruptcy.
Right.
What would you do?
Well, I've written a lot about Detroit. What I would do is the following, I think, as starters. They've got most of their streetlights don't work. They've got, I think, about 80,000 abandoned structures in that community. But they also have some positive things happening. So what I would do is actually some steps that are now being taken, which is I think the most important thing you can do is get some of those streetlights working, at least in areas where people live, because if the lights aren't turned on, people will assume no one lives there. You can't feel safe. If you have a kid who's going to school in the morning in the dark in Detroit during the winter and there are no streetlights, why in God's name would you think that kid's going to be safe and will want to wake up and go to school? So number one is we've got to turn the lights back on to demonstrate that someone still lives there.
Uh-huh.
Number two, the response rate for police can be up to an hour. In some cases, the police don't respond at all, and ambulance and fire services. So it seems to me that if you want to demonstrate that we care about people, we want people to live in this town, we value people in their lives, you've got to do something about the response rate and probably the relationship between, for instance, the police and the community itself. Third, there are some really positive things happening in that town. There are new businesses moving downtown. There are parks that have been rejuvenated. 300 of their parks, I think, two-thirds of their parks have been closed, if I remember correctly. There are about 100 that are left open. They've got to marshal the resources of the community, meaning people, volunteers, businesses, to come together and start to take action together to demonstrate again that they have the wherewithal and the wisdom and the know-how to get some stuff done in that community, and that they don't have to rely on people on the outside to get things moving in the right direction. So those are some things. And then lastly, what I would say is, as I was starting to say, they've got some businesses moving downtown. and other places. They've got some schools that are performing fairly well. They've got to continue to deepen and spread some of those successes, and they've got to learn how to tell a story about Detroit that's more positive, that shines the light on the things that are happening in a positive direction as opposed to talking about everything that's so damn negative.
We have a question from a caller. We have Tom from Little Lake Harbor Township. Tom, you're on the air with Rich Harwood.
Hey, Bob, how you doing?
Good.
Here we go. Here goes old school and what our country is based upon. When this country started 200 years ago, even back in the 30s and 40s, after the war, how this country stood together and built each neighborhood and each town. It seems like what's happening now, we're lessening our states and our municipalities because they feel they get invaded by, low-income housing and everything. And what happened is, with our country, why don't our country turn around and start taking care of these areas, reinvesting in them? And instead of worrying about other countries in the world, we worry about taking care of other countries that we don't have money to take care of, that we need to take care of its own country. If we would take back our own cities and our counties and our neighborhoods instead of letting them abandon and then turn into nothing. That's why, the problem is, too, especially in New Jersey, we pay high property taxes, and people can't afford to live here, and they're leaving the state. And, the casinos are struggling. They're coming up with ideas. It's because the cost to stay where you're at, and there's no industry, no jobs. That's why these areas get aborted, and then we don't care about it. We worry about other countries and trying to get them back. We need to get back the fundamental back into this country to get it where it's supposed to be, not where we're just going to let it go. I see it happening in every city. I mean, Detroit's one. What's another city going to happen? I mean, it's a shame. Our country's going to the tubes.
Yeah, it's happening not too far from you.
Thanks, Tom.
There's some things with Tom I would want to have a larger conversation about, but basically, one of the things that Tom said was we need to get back to fundamentals, and I wrote a book about a year ago that was based on essentially a walk I took across the country, talking to Americans from all different walks of life about where we are, where we need to go, about the status of their lives and the country and their communities. And, Bob, one of the clear messages that came out of that walk was people saying we need to get back to basics, which we need to learn to be more compassionate towards one another. We need to have a greater concern for the common good. And importantly, to what Tom was just talking about and what I was saying about Detroit, is, we've got to get people out of their homes back into community life and working to improve their communities where they live so that we can rebuild a sense of trust and relationships and our confidence, really, that we can get things done together, and that we're not on our own going it alone, but that we're actually working as a community.
Tom, I'm sorry, Rich, I actually have to take another break, and I think the best thing for me to do right in this point is to let you wrap it up. This has really been interesting. I've certainly enjoyed your conversation and the things that you're trying to do, and like Tom said, it's just back to basics. It's people communicating, figuring out, people always tell you what they want to do. You just have to listen, right? You have to listen, and then we have to figure out practical ways to move forward together. Why don't you tell us where we can get your book, your latest book? Yeah, go to our website is the easiest thing, which is www.theharwoodinstitute.org. And that's it. Rich Harwood, we certainly appreciate you and your efforts, and I think maybe we ought to get you into Detroit. Maybe you can fix that place a little bit, too. Huh? All right, sounds good. Rich Harwood, thank you very much. Certainly appreciate you being there. All right, be well. All right. You're listening to Bob Burns in Your Afternoon, and we need to take a commercial break, and we'll be back in just a couple minutes.
News Talk 1400 WOND.